times, a pandemic, a recession, this unusual election. And tonight, we do know that more people are voting early than any time in history. This current rate is over 6 times last cycle, topping 47 million ballots in. If this continues, we could see some of the highest turnout ever. And no matter which candidate you like, that's objectively a great thing for democracy. In fact, in democracies around the world, experts view high participation as positive. And if voter turnout falls too low, it's viewed as a potential warning for civic decay. Now, this shouldn't be a partisan issue. I could point you to high turnout elections where Democrats won the White House, like '08, or where the GOP won, like Ronald Reagan. But there is a sad fact today. The evidence shows that the current Republican Party under Trump does not support high civic or voter participation. It does not welcome high levels of voting. Now, that may sound like criticism. That may sound incriminating, but I'm just here to give you facts, and it is literally what Trump admits he thinks. He thinks if you have high levels of voting, then Republicans don't get elected.
They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
That's wrong. Government should never restrict voting to distort elections, of course, because one, it violates citizen rights, regardless of any outcome effect. And two, it can distort the outcome, which ruins the point of having a democracy. And yet efforts to limit the vote in the U.S. are rampant, which brings us to tonight's special report. We think it may be crucial to your right to vote right now. Big picture, the coverage of elections often sort of assumes a level playing field. We hear about polls and turnout models and voting mechanics that are inside this current universe. But it doesn't always reflect how voter suppression looms over all of this. And there's a paradox here in American history. This is a nation that did lead the world towards a more democratic model of government, which is a plus. But this is not a nation that's honored everyone's equal right to vote. The founders were ahead of their time in some ways. They presented ideals that'd be quoted for hundreds of years, and they were behind the demands of moral obligations of equality in many other important ways. So when people say things like America's the world's oldest democracy, it's partly true that America has a pioneering experiment in voting, and it is also false if you just use the definition of democracy as a system where everyone votes. Because this nation began by barring most people from voting. It was only for wealthy white men who had land or paid taxes. We know that changed slowly over time. In fact, if you just read the Constitution, you'll see there are more amendments for expanding voting than any other single topic. One in 1870 that said all men could vote, purportedly including black men. 50 years later, you have one that says all women could vote, and other groups have fought to extend and democratize the vote. And people began to choose U.S. senators directly instead of state politicians in another constitutional reform. And so while some of those expansions were consistent, for example, once women got that right to vote legally, there were not new state laws cracking down on voting by gender. But it's always been different with race in America. Broad reforms that extended voting rights were then met with backlashes to limit them. New constitutional amendments that push forward voting rights are then pulled back through things that you've heard about: the poll taxes, the literacy tests, the voter purges, intimidation, and yes, even violence and anti-black terrorism. New protections then later pushed forward federal laws to protect the right to vote, including MLK's Voting Rights Act. Then that gets pulled back in the courts and attacked by other means, like recent restrictive voter ID laws. This is an important layer we all need to keep in mind because it's relevant, this long history of racism, regardless of political party. But today, as an additional political matter, something runs alongside this, and it's an electoral reality that some people aren't comfortable just bluntly discussing. But when more people vote in U.S. national elections, Republicans do very poorly. There are some places, of course, where Republicans do well with high turnout, like, say, Kentucky or Georgia, but not in national elections. When more people vote, when there's high turnout, Republicans just tend to lose. You can see that in the total votes. More people voted to put a Democrat in the White House in 2016. You can see it in the fact that Democrats win the White House typically by far more than Republicans. We checked by about 7 million, whereas when Republicans do it, it's more like 84,000. Then there's a starker way to see this. No matter what the choices have been in the modern era, from the Republican Party's new lurch to Trump, to more traditional options like John McCain, to several of those races with Bushes, Americans actually tend to just choose the Democrat for president. Did you know that's the case in 6 of the last 7 presidential elections? 6 out of 7. Sounds wild, but here's that history. It may not always feel this way because in 2 of these races, the less popular Republican candidate with fewer votes ended up in the White House in 2016 and 2000. But that's the blue tendency. That's why the modern Republican Party has a problem. Now, there's more than one way to deal with it, but instead of trying to appeal to more of those blue majorities, the GOP is often focused on finding narrow paths in the Electoral College, which is legal, by the way, but also it's experimented with trying to continue these efforts to suppress the right to vote, sometimes illegally. Now, this is a reality today. Republicans don't simply need to motivate their base. In national races, they try to deflate Democratic turnout. Now, some of that is legal, I want to be very clear. Candidates, for example, can use their words to discourage the other side from turning out. The government can even regulate voting in ways that impact turnout legally up to a point. Then there are the other ways that this can be criminal, like formal voter suppression. Now, state officials are clashing right now about how to count mail ballots. And if it's a close result, you may hear a lot more about this. Republicans have been arguing for stricter approaches, which can be legal. Pennsylvania GOP trying to limit the counting of mail votes, for example, and a deadlocked Supreme Court just rejected that. Then you have the rollback of MLK's Voting Rights Act, which has enabled many southern states to legally close over 1,000 polling places. But that's not all. Republicans have been pushing new voter restrictions across 41 different states in the past decade, including something that was never demanded in hundreds of years of our American experiment in voting, trying to create this new legal requirement that citizens must bring a photo ID just to vote.
We're protecting the integrity of each and every vote here in the state of Wisconsin.
The photo ID laws are intended to stop impersonation fraud, double voting.
Your vote can be stolen. The very freedom of our nation is based on the integrity of our ballot box.
If you have to show a picture ID to buy Sudafed, and you should have to show picture ID to protect the one of the most valuable, most central, sacred rights and blessed within America, the right to vote.
No. The Constitution holds the opposite. If you have an important right like free speech, the government can't just add random burdens and restrictions to it. You have the right to march or criticize the government right now, even if you don't bring ID to the march. But these Republican efforts, it's important to understand, they were not genuinely about confirming the identity of who's voting. They were about something else that many...
We want to do everything we can to help our side, and sometimes we think that's voter ID, sometimes we think that's longer lines, whatever it may be.
I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
Then I found out the real reason for the law.
The law is going to kick the Democrats in the butt.
Hillary Clinton is about the weakest candidate the Democrats have ever put up, and now we have photo ID, and I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference as well.
This will certainly drive up turnout. This will be extremely devastating to Republicans and conservatives in Georgia.
They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
There you have it. The photo ID wasn't about election integrity. It was about helping a party. Trump just plagiarized this playbook like he plagiarized his campaign slogan. Now, this operates in addition to the racial issues I mentioned to reduce the vote, sometimes legally. 35 states right now still use these voter ID laws. And the facts matter. This may overlap with the historically racist playbook, but it's also wielded against a wider group of voters who are targeted as potential Democrats. And I want to be clear, there's other efforts that can be flatly illegal. It's a crime for campaigns to try to stop someone from voting. So formal voter suppression is different than these state laws. And this is wrong no matter the goal of the party or person doing it. But Republicans are facing the evidence of doing it more lately. Now, Trump took it in a very different